Welcome to the Football Pod. My name is Konstantin Eckner, and please welcome my co-host, Abel Mezaros.
Hi, Konstantin. Hi, everyone. Today, we want to talk about a topic that has been more and more a conversation in football, and something that we're finally having, which is about mental health. Last week it was Mental Health Awareness Week. So we wanted to talk about this issue because it's something that, players and coaches are feeling that they are opening up about, and we want to make sure that we get somebody who is not an expert, but he's somebody who writes about this. And this is Tom Hamilton, senior writer at ESPN.
All right, Tom, thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Thanks, chaps. Thanks for having me.
So we've invited you especially because of your coverage of mental health in football. You have been working on several subjects for ESPN over the years, but that's one I was most intrigued about because I don't know that many journalists that are covering mental health in football and sports in general. And we have to make clear, you are not an expert. You are not a trained psychologist or anything. You're a journalist who's researching on the subject. But I think you're doing a very, very great job at doing it so, and that's also why we have invited you. And I wanted to ask you first, maybe, when did you start working on that particular subject?
I think it was probably as a result of sort of personal circumstance. It's mental health is something that's run through my family, and it affects me. So when you're given a platform like ESPN, which is incredible at storytelling, and has an amazing audience, that it was something which I've always been really passionate about. So it's an area that I know pretty well from personal experience, not from a sort of a medical point of view, but from more like an emotional and point of view, and one where I can understand. So it was something where it's an area of storytelling which I've always found fascinating. Those sort of human interest stories are ones which I just love telling, and love telling stories about incredible athletes. But it was an area which I've long been sort of an advocate for people being able to talk openly about, and been lucky that a few people have been happy to talk about it. There are others, who I'm sure deal with mental health in sort of every single day of their life, every single hour of their life. But it's an area which hopefully we're starting to become a lot better at talking about. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, I spoke to Joe Bryan at Fulham, and his message was talking is so key, and it really does help once you start talking to someone else about how you're feeling.
So when it comes to storytelling, of course, mental health and some of these personal stories can be very delicate, and you have to be careful how you approach it, how you write about it. Still, readers should be interested in reading about it, but it shouldn't be too entertaining in a way. Because then you don't take it too serious or not seriously enough. So how do you approach writing about it when it comes to storytelling? Or what's your general approach? What's your thinking behind it? How do you make sure that you write in the right way?
I guess it depends on who you're talking to, and it's you end up in those sort of instances, just you want to tell it in their voice. It's their story. It's a very personal thing. So it all has to be geared towards their experiences, the story they've got, and trying to tell that. Sometimes it's the easiest job in the world because they're so open and so give you such a sort of insight into how they're feeling that you can just let the quotes run. And I think sometimes that's the most sort of powerful way, to be honest. So I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all approach. I think it's more down to the subjects and how they speak and the story they've got.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is how do we sort of define like this mental health? Like what falls under this umbrella term in terms of sports, right? Because I think growing up as a sports fan and then you're doing this professionally, there's always these stories, right? And you hear stories about, different players, whether they're idols or for example, Gerd Müller in Germany, right? Who had this long-standing struggle with alcoholism. And I think what's interesting is as you grow up, at least for me, like the way we view those things as you mature are very different. And I think the way we talk about them is very different, right? Like, and so that's one of the things I wanted to ask you is, would you, for example, classify that like an alcoholism under mental health, or would that be more something?
I'm honestly not sure. I guess it's, I wouldn't really know on that one exactly how to sort of, I guess, find an exact sort of definition of it, but it's more, mental health is very personal. So something like alcoholism is a condition where I guess you're addicted, aren't you? So whether that comes in, I'm not sure, but I guess it's just a sort of an umbrella term covering these things, because you know that when players retire from football, a huge number of them go through, they lose money, they're trying to fill this void in their lives, trying to fill the routine which they had, and the thrill of playing in front of fans, and suddenly that's gone. So again, it's personal. I wouldn't know whether, how to exactly define it. I just know that it kind of brings in the importance, I guess, of being open.
But maybe like to kind of rephrase that or reframe this question is like I think the ESPN was actually really good at they had this documentary, like I think it might have been like a 30 for 30 about broke, which is how the NFL players who lost their money and how they subsequently battled a lot of these things, depression, and I think a lot of times like alcoholism will obviously go hand in hand with some of those things. But like that's what I wanted to ask you is, was there sort of a moment for you when you thought about talking about it differently or covering it differently, or because I don't know, like I'm trying to pinpoint a moment in sports culture where we like started talking about it, because I mean maybe in Germany it's Robert Enke who like there are all these landmark cases, right? And I'm trying to think of what it is. I mean, maybe what was it for you that sort of said, okay, like I should contribute to this?
It's probably when I read the Robert Enke book, to be honest, which was like heartbreaking and in its own way, sort of inspirational in its own right. But the story was written. I mean, the story of Robert Enke's tragic, but then you see the stoicism and the way that his wife and the foundation came from there, and the amazing work that they do as well. So reading that story was a pretty profound moment, I think, for me. It was, it's just beyond sort of, you can't really contemplate what those closest to him must have been going through, let alone what he would have been. So I think that story really did start the conversation, I think, within football around mental health. And then you hear, and then people start to speak more. So, I mean, recently we've had, like, a couple of years ago, Buffon, one of the greatest ever goalkeepers, was talking about how he missed a match due to a panic attack. And I think these sort of stories suddenly make mental health perhaps more relatable to people who might be experiencing certain feelings or, confused about the way they're feeling. And suddenly you hear, hey, Buffon, he had this panic attack, he missed a game. And then there are other people talking about it recently, like Gregory van der Veel, the Dutch player, or we've got Jordan Ibe here in the UK as well, who's been very open about depression. People like Joe Bryan as well, who's talking about anxiety and panic attacks. And I think, though, for me personally, it was reading about Robert Enke and then finding that, say, that how he described, or how the author described Robert Enke's depression. And then it was something where I was like, right, I think it kind of fueled a bit of a fire in me to hopefully help make a little bit of a difference.
I think, and that's something I think Abel was also getting at, is that there was still a time, because sports and professional sports is so in the public eye, and I think there is to an extent, there is a degree of stage fright and just general anxiety, which you usually have, and maybe to a small extent you should probably have if you are performing in front of people, that at least you are kind of nervous, and I think that's normal for everyone that's an entertainer, or that's just in front of a lot of people performing anything, be it sports, be it show business or whatever. So I think there was also the thinking often that I mean, they are just overly excited, or there's over anxiety in a way, but it's not really a mental health issue. Do you have you spoken to people who said or who explained maybe where the boundary is, basically, where maybe something like being down after a loss or being overly anxious is maybe behind the person, and then really the real mental health issue starts? Because I think there are some blurry lines there.
Yeah, and I mean, what are you asking about? Whether, say, performance anxiety is a sign that's symptomatic of a wider issue? Like, again, you'd have to speak to the individuals, I think, in that case, because I mean, the pressure these guys are under is something which I imagine that most of us can't really completely relate to, and that feeling of, but it's part of, for example, you know, that feeling of playing in front of hundreds of thousands of fans is something which they get adjusted to. And for the youngsters you speak to, they're terrified the first time they run out of the stadium. Then you become more accustomed to it and the noise and everything. But it's, I imagine from the stories which are coming out, it's more people talking about the moments away from them, away in like the quiet moments in their hotels when they're away from the family and they're bored, or they're overthinking, they're going down rabbit holes and emotions. And it's those sort of stories which are now coming out a little bit more, which perhaps that we can, as us mere mortals, can relate to a little bit more, rather than the sort of the pressure of playing in front of, I don't know, a packed Old Trafford or whatever, which I would find completely terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, like what I always wonder about in these cases, right, is that there's the natural glorification of athletes, right, and identification with them and treating them as heroes, right? And I think like these sort of stories of, like, I think Wayne Rooney talking about his gambling addiction early in his career, when he would sit in hotel rooms and discover that you can bet online and you know, just have these huge wagers on matches. It makes them, like, I think it makes them more relatable, right? Because it makes them like you know, like you or me or anybody who's watching them. But I think part of the issue, at least, and you can, I don't know if people agree with me on this or not, it'd be interesting, but like some people don't want to have that narrative, right? Like they want to have that the glorious hero concept, and sometimes it doesn't fit the picture. So I'm wondering, like, where you stand on this, right? Because I think maybe the concept of our athletes and heroes changes with how we get mental health into that picture.
I see what you mean. I guess there would be some people who wouldn't want to admit that perhaps they are fallible, but it's more down to personal perspective. I think that I'd like to think that we're getting to the stage now where if someone spoke openly about, whoever it is, spoke openly about struggles they'd have in their private lives with this sort of thing, that it wouldn't in any way diminish how we see them. I mean, you'd like to think that, if anything, for me, my heroes in sport are the people who've overcome adversity to get to where they are, because they're inspiring figures, and it's, you know, those stories are absolutely incredible. But I think it's, I guess that sort of thing comes down to identity as well, because you've got these young guys, especially in academies, who for so long, up to the age of 16, have been Constantine the footballer. And then when suddenly they're told you're not good enough to make the cut into the first team, they completely lose this bit, the footballer, and now they're Constantine. And suddenly you're like, well, exactly who am I? And then from there, that can sometimes unravel. And it's those sort of things, this identity, I think is really interesting. And I think we're slowly getting to a point now, well, not slowly, we are getting to a point where you are hearing footballers talking more openly now about the fact that they're not defined by football. Joe said this to me when I interviewed him at ESPN last week, was that Joe O'Brien is someone who has so many interests outside of football. He's a fantastic bloke, really, really interesting guy, great company, like reads an incredible amount of books, fascinating on so many different subjects. And he's not Joe O'Brien the footballer. It just so happens that he's really, really bloody good at football, but his identity is not defined by his ability on the pitch. So I think we're getting to a better awareness of this now, and especially during the last year, you know, with COVID and the mental toll which this has taken on players on the fields. Some of the players are mentally exhausted, and you hear the coaches talking about it. The players themselves probably haven't been as open, but it's the coaches who can see that mental fatigue has become a really big thing. And it's, you know, perhaps circumstance, perhaps more people speaking openly about it, but I think there's a greater appreciation now for the fact that footballers aren't perfect. Footballers aren't we hold them up as these gods, but again, that's all subjective on who you are and who your heroes are, I think, as well.
So when you're, I mean, what I want to ask is because when you're bringing up that academy players, for instance, are struggling, especially if they are told they are not good enough or they are basically not succeeding at what they wanted to achieve, getting to the first team, getting to the Premier League, Bundesliga, what have you. And even for experienced players, even for senior players who are maybe going down a rabbit hole for some reason. I mean, it doesn't really matter what the reason is, but they are going down and they are struggling with mental health. Are there already institutions in place, established by the clubs, by the associations, anywhere? Is there something in place where they can go to, even anonymous, or is it still kind of they are out there on their own and they have to deal with the struggle themselves and know what? I mean, maybe some individuals are helping them. Are there any institutions already in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the clubs are great over here now. It's certainly something where they have full-time psychologists working with it, and it's the same throughout sport. So I spend a lot of my time also reporting about rugby, and clubs bring in psychologists to work with the players. There are places, there's the Sporting Chance Clinic, which was established by Tony Adams, which I know has helped people in the past, and the Priory as well. But I think there's certainly, I'd like to think, I mean, I'm not a footballer, so I wouldn't know, but I'd like to think there are a number of options available. I mean, with Joe, it took the club physio to notice that he just wasn't himself at all, and he was getting down and he was overthinking, and she could sense that something wasn't quite right with him. So she directed him to chat to someone, and he did. But I think the hardest thing about it is hard to, when you are in the grips of, say, I don't know, depression or anxiety, it's hard to admit that you're struggling sometimes. And the last thing you want to do is chat to a complete stranger and say, hey, I'm feeling shit, let's have a chat, because it goes against absolutely everything you're feeling in that moment. But I think the idea of talking as much as possible is so therapeutic, and it's, I know there might be a bit of a stigma around, say, medication still, but equally, if your hand was going to drop off at the start of the day, you take a pill, right, to prevent your hand from dropping off. And it's the same with mental health. If your brain, the levels aren't right, then there are, you chat to someone and then they can help. So I'd like to think that there are definitely a number of options available. And I think the clubs here, from what I've learned, from what I've seen, are certainly, this is definitely on their radar, especially after this season, which has been like none other, where you're in bubbles. You haven't got the same sort of freedoms you've had before. Families are affected. There's a lot of concern, a lot of nervousness around their loved ones and people you can't see, etc. So I'd like to think definitely there are places and people available.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because, like, this whole, I'm glad you brought up the pandemic aspect of this, because that's the part where I feel like I haven't read enough on this in terms of reporting on the mental health of the players, because it seems like nobody's interested in that, right? Like that was the one takeaway from the Super League, is that, the commodification of players, and like where they weren't really asked what they thought about this thing, which impacts their future. It's their job. And similarly, I think it was John Harding who wrote this piece for DW about mental health and mental well-being, and he's always talking a lot about how much of this on the club side is performance, improving performance, versus the well-being of the player, right? And I'm wondering, like, where you stand, or what examples you have seen of this, because I think that there's obviously the incentive for clubs to improve the player's performance. Whether that same incentive exists to care about their well-being, it's less obvious to me.
It's a great question, and I don't know. I think it's probably down to the club. I mean, and the way they operate. I'd like to think that I was chatting to a rugby player in a different sport last week, and he was saying he still hasn't yet heard within his club of anyone saying that they just felt like their mental health was crap and they just couldn't play. If they're injured, then it's a clear thing, right? And they're pressured to play, but he doesn't feel yet that we've got to the stage whereby, this was in rugby, and I don't know if it's the same in football, I haven't yet looked into this, where someone would openly say to the coach, you know what, I just can't do it today. But I guess those sort of things are still very confidential. But you do hear of players taking time out from the game, but it's not normally well publicised exactly why, and you have to be very respectful of this. But I honestly wouldn't know on that front. I think it's probably, perhaps that's the next stage of our understanding. And I was chatting to Ralph Ragnick about this a couple of months ago, and he was saying that the next stage he feels of development when it comes to players is on the cognitive side of things, where you're looking at the brain. And I imagine things like exhaustion and mental fatigue would come into that as well. But that's probably like the next sort of frontier of player development. And we've had things like, for example, there are teams that bring in eye coaches to focus on your eyes and how you can do a spatial awareness and reflexes and things like this. Okay, so that's all connected with the brain and nerve endings and things like this. So you'd like to think that they'll start to be looking at mental, the mental side of things. And I think sleep studies are going to play a huge part in this and recovery and the importance of sleep. I know that some clubs are using this thing called an Aura ring, which monitors how players sleep. And they find, for example, if they play Call of Duty until 11:30 in the evening, then they don't sleep very well. But if they stop playing Call of Duty, if they stop playing Call of Duty at, say, 10 o'clock and you read for an hour, then you will sleep better and therefore you recover better and the rest of it. So, I think that's, these sort of studies as well. So I guess that's sort of the next frontier, the next sort of step, I think, is really understanding the mental side of how to increase someone's performance on the mental side as related purely to physical.
Just in terms of following up on this, you're probably right in the sense that they're like these conversations are not being had, or people are not thinking about it in clubs because they're probably focused on other things. But I think Arsene Wenger has talked about the cognitive side as well, and it's no surprise to hear finally talk about this as well. But what I'm wondering about is whether we're having the same thing with coaches, because coaches' mental health. I think recently it was Jurgen Klopp's mother passing was obviously talking about his grief, or the new Leverkusen coach, who's Gerardo Selene from Young Boys. He was talking about how he could barely sleep after some losses, and I don't think I've ever really heard coaches talk about mental health so much, right? Like we somehow don't think of them, and maybe that's another frontier. I don't know if you've had experiences within your career in terms of the interviews with coaches. Have they talked about that?
I've tried.
I feel like that's not something they would.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's an area where I've spoken to a couple who didn't want to go on the record about it because they were worried that a club would see this and perceive them to be mentally weak, and that's, I guess, the next. Yeah, and I guess they were worried about perception and appearing to be anything less than 100% or perhaps vulnerable, or any of these sort of, these common tropes which are perhaps associated, these lazy tropes are associated with mental health. So
you're not a workaholic, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's fascinating to hear Jurgen Klopp talking about grief and the impact that had on him. But I think from a mental health point of view, coaches, I just find fascinating because whereas, they really just don't switch off. They're exhausted. And you see some coaches who sort of thrive off that pressure and they really relish it. They really relish it. I did a piece last year about what it's like to get sacked and the process they go through when they're unemployed and what they get up to. And some are very good at it and some aren't. And, it's like the guy, I don't know if you ever watched The Office with Ricky Gervais, but when he gets sacked, he's still coming back in the whole time, right? And I guess this coaches must have the same sort of feeling where it's their club, they don't really know what to do with themselves. But I think mental health in football management and in coaching really it's so fascinating. But I like to think that that's an area where people will start being more open.
Ralf Rangnick was also one who talked about his struggles and basically he quit the business in a way for at least a short period of time because he was burned out, or he had a burnout. and he was also talking about at the time about his unhealthy behavior or unhealthy lifestyle he had, because he came in late at home. Then he after 10 or 11 he ate some sugary stuff and didn't get any sleep and was still, because especially someone like him who's always like talking and doing stuff and is always thinking about 1,000 things at a time. And then he didn't really eat healthy, and it's just, it came together. A lot of different things came together, and you couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't go to his job basically anymore. But I think, and I wanted to get Tom your take on that, and maybe even Abel, because I just a hypothesis. But sometimes when you think about it, there are coaches who might not want to reveal that they are mentally struggling. There might be players who don't want to reveal that they are mentally struggling, especially if they feel themselves in leadership position, for instance, or if they are on the verge of getting to a starting 11 spot or something like that. When they are feeling they have to perform right now, that can be their big break. And they are fearing that the club would see them as mentally weak and unreliable. I sometimes feel like the wider public is much more understanding and when it comes to mental health struggle than some of the like really inner parts of football or inner parts of professional sports. I mean, you brought up rugby. I think it might be the same or even worse. I don't know. But is it maybe even that the wider public is much more understanding that some folks that are actually in football?
Yeah, I think that's hard, because I think one of the big, sort of from talking to people at the moment, one of the big triggers for triggering anxiety in players is social media, right? And it can be so toxic, and that sort of faceless abuse which players get and this sort of thing. I mean, I guess it completely depends on who you talk to. I'd like to think that everyone, hopefully society is becoming a lot more understanding now and a lot more educated and appreciative of people being open about mental health. Perhaps they might be experiencing something similar, but they just didn't really realise it, or perhaps didn't want to talk about it. But I think it's the same with high performance. There was, if you look through high performance, I don't really know exactly what's going on in the States regarding mental health, but I'd like to think hopefully getting to a point whereby that wouldn't necessarily be held against someone. In fact, that being brave and talking openly would hopefully be seen as a positive trait and more of a reason to employ someone.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, Konstantin, I always struggle with this sort of like wider public's conception and inside it, because they're so hard, because I feel like everyone is in a little bit of a bubble, like, themselves. So like what you see, like, for example, I see on Twitter, just to connect it to social media, I see both the side of it's a lot more accepted to talk about these kind of issues like mental health. But then there's also like just the amplified abuse of the horrible side of social media that you could choose to ignore. But I mean, I'm sure I'm sure each of you we've all gotten those kind of messages, and we're mostly just covering these answers. We're not high performing athletes, but you still, I mean, at least you still get the occasional like mean things written about you or to you. And I mean, there was a campaign right recently with Jordan Henderson, and then obviously in Germany as well, the stopping sort of the online abuse, and then obviously the blackout social media. Was it maybe about a couple of weeks ago? Do you think those campaigns are effective in that sense, like to maybe improve things, Tom? Like, where do you stand on this, or would you do sort of something similar to, or what would you do to kind of improve things if you could?
Don't know really. I think I'm of the view personally that social media should have more accountability when it comes to individuals logging their thoughts. I'm all for positive action, and I guess the true effectiveness of these sort of movements will be something where we'll see in time, really. But Jordan Henderson, I know, has been a wonderful advocate for helping stop the abuse players receive and individuals receive, and those sort of messages hopefully will be cutting through causing people to think twice before they send something abusive or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to judge, and also, I mean, you got social media today, which can be really amplifying kind of the abuse and just the outrage you receive from fans, be it from your own club, be it from opposing teams. I mean, it's not necessarily new in football or in any sports, because when you read stories from the old times even. Like it was always the way that when you went to an away match, for instance, you got abuse in a way that was, I mean, that was far from anything acceptable. But in a football stadium or in in an arena, in a sports arena, it might be something else. The abuse and kind of the insults and the length some fans went to actually insult people was kind of outstanding. And but I think the difference is, and maybe that's something to as a part conclusion, is that maybe the difference from today to, I don't know, the 70s or something, is that back in the day, players had to deal with the same kind of abuse, maybe not through social media, but still in stadiums, or when they arrived with the bus at the stadium or something like that, where it wasn't as protected as it is today. But they might not wanted to accept that they had a mental health struggle or something, because it was so unacceptable even in a wider society to mentally struggle, or a lot of people even didn't knew about what mental health might be, or mentally struggling might be. So I think there's actually at least something improving in a way that are more people are much more informed about it and much more understanding that there is actually something that can affect people quite heavily, be it in your family, be it on a sports field, be it anywhere at your workplace or so. So I think that's at least an improvement. Although I don't think we are quite there yet where it comes to when it comes to acceptance and just dealing with these things appropriately, fully.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's going to take time, but it's the sort of the courage and the openness of those guys who have been talking about it, who talk about their struggles with mental health, which will hopefully change any perceptions or stop taboos and break through the taboo of talking about mental health. And the more that people talk openly about it, hopefully the more society as a whole accepts that people do struggle with mental health, and it becomes something which we all can talk about openly rather than perhaps feel a little reluctant to.
Before we let you leave, Tom, just because you talked about that you have been reporting on mental health issues and interviewed players and coaches and so on, can you name maybe one or two stories you can recommend to the listeners? You've written that maybe were the most gut-wrenching, or maybe something where you say that I would recommend to read that piece, or these two pieces, because just people have to read it because of the story.
That's a great question. I think I'd start definitely by reading the Robert Enke book, Alive Too Short, which was just beautifully written, and it's extremely profound. I think that's probably a good starting place. I'm trying to have a think now. I know that we've done a lot of great work at ESPN around the issue. We've got on the website at the moment, there's a sort of a landing page with all the coverage we've had from the last month or so from around the business, from different sports, and there are tales there from people talking about mental health and their experiences and their battles, but they're all incredibly inspiring. So I think that's a really good spot to have a look there. I think it's just be curious, go out there and have a look, read about it, understand, and see if you can relate to it. So if not, just talk, ask your friends, how are you today? This sort of thing. I know it sounds a little bit sort of cheesy or whatever, but it's so important, especially in a pandemic when we've spent so long isolated. Just keep on talking.
Yeah, if the listeners want to get a hold of the Robert Enke book, it's written by Ronald Reng. Just type in Robert Enke on Google or on Amazon or some other book, or go to your local bookstore and order it there to help them out, whatever you want to do. And we will also link to the ESPN landing page on our show notes, so that people can find that immediately from there and read more about what you have done and what other people at ESPN have done. So Tom, thank you for your time. It was great talking to you.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me. Very kind of you.
So Tom is at Tom Hamilton ESPN on Twitter. Abel is at BundesPL on Twitter, and I am CC_Eckner on Twitter. If you want to support us, please visit patreon.com/thefootballpod. And for now, We out.